A bulk of the military conflicts that have taken place in the 20th century are a fairly direct result of oil. The first example is World War II. Now, World War II could be considered an oil war in two different ways. The first one is the Japanese decision to bomb Pearl Harbor directly stems from an American oil embargo in 1940, and also the war was fought using oil as a critical technology to aid the Allies. The Allies used oil to not only fuel tanks and airplanes, but also to make artificial or human-produced rubber for tires and things like that. So the war was won in part because of oil and was fought in part because of oil. The next story I want to tell has to do with Iran in 1953. So on the map here, you have Iran up here. And briefly, I want to tell the story of nationalism and oil in Iran and the impact that oil plays in that country. This story goes back to the early 20th century when Britain had taken control of the area of the Middle East of Iraq and Jordan going into Iran as part of a mandate. Now, the mandate after World War I. Iran was technically a separate country, and British influence went as far as Iraq. The thing that Britain did was sign a deal with the imperial leaders of Iran at the beginning of the century to explore oil. And they cut a deal that said, you let us explore for oil in Iran, and we'll give you 16% of the profits. Britain does this. They find a massive amount of oil, probably more oil than anywhere else in the world, certainly at that time. And they cook the books, more or less, to say they're not earning profits and give Iran very little money, and they are making huge, huge profits in oil every single year. So that goes on from the time of 1907 until the 1950s. The thing that changes in the early 1950s is the rise of nationalism in Iran, and in particular, a nationalist leader who became prime minister in 1951 named Mohammad Mossadegh. Mohammad Mossadegh, I think, is one of the coolest people of the 20th century. He was an Iranian diplomat, and he served several different posts, but was very ideologically committed to the idea of nationalism and freedom from external factors in Iran, or external powers in Iran. And if he saw that the leader, whose the title in Iran is called the Shah, if he saw the Shah was being too close to other powers like Britain, he left, and he quit like 4 or 5 different jobs as finance minister and other jobs in Iran because he felt that the leaders were not being sufficiently independent. He becomes prime minister in 1951 on the platform that he is going to nationalize the oil industry, which means he will take over all the oil fields and claim them as Iranian property and kick Britain out of Iran. The British government is, not surprisingly, massively opposed to this and tries to pressure the United States to stop Iran from doing this. And the United States doesn't really care about British oil profits that much. I mean, they probably do, but not enough to change the government in Iran. The thing that Britain is able to convince the United States and convince Harry Truman, and then ultimately Dwight Eisenhower in the transition of the presidency, is that Iran was a potential communist threat, and nationalism and nationalization of oil means that they're going to lead down the communist road. So the United States and the CIA orchestrates a coup in Iran where we remove Mossadegh from power and reestablish basically supreme control of the leader, who's the Shah of Iran, who became a dictator, was pretty much a dictator before, but still a relatively weak leader, and he basically had absolute power in Iran from 1953 until the Iranian Revolution in 1979. And this is an example of Britain and the United States changing the government of a country in order to maintain oil profits in the Middle East. So the third example is the 1990 Gulf War. And in 1990, let's see if we can erase this red line here. In 1990, Iraq, who is here, had just finished fighting an 8-year war against Iran. And the government of Iraq, led by Saddam Hussein, who had been given U.S. aid during the Iran-Iraq War, Saddam Hussein invades the tiny country of Kuwait, which is its neighbor. So let's erase this circle here. So Iraq invades Kuwait in 1990, and the response is a U.S.-led international coalition of countries to fight against Iraq in what became known as the Gulf War. And the Gulf War was fought to preserve Kuwaiti independence, but America doesn't really care that much about Kuwait as a national security interest. America cares about Kuwait primarily because of oil and the possibility that America could lose oil coming from the Middle East. So the United Nations starts a war against Iraq and forces Saddam Hussein to go back into Iraq, and the U.S. is able to liberate Kuwait. And that goes on in 1990, 1991. If you go forward about a decade, you have the post-9/11 war in Iraq. And in this war, Saddam Hussein, still in power, the U.S. decides that he is considered a significant military threat. There's the argument that the U.S. takes to the United Nations that Saddam Hussein has weapons of mass destruction. And this war is complicated. There are multiple potential causes of the war in Iraq, and it's very much tied up in certainly today, I think, a partisan political explanation. That said, there's no doubt, and the documentation of the defense of the war for the Bush administration is very clear on this, that the war in Iraq is an attempt, in part, to preserve stable oil supplies from the Middle East. And ultimately, the U.S. invades Iraq, overthrows the government of Saddam Hussein, and sets up its own provisional government with a transition towards democratic elections in Iraq. So we have several examples of oil wars in the 20th century. So at the same time that oil is facilitating economic development around the world, oil has also been a source of conflict in the 20th century. All right, the other topic is nuclear power. And here's the brief timeline of nuclear power. Then we'll talk about some of the pros and cons. First of all, the origin of nuclear power, you could trace back earlier than the 1940s. Certainly the identification of radiation from Marie Curie and scientific developments with uranium in the 1930s both contribute to what becomes known as the Manhattan Project during World War II. And this is the U.S. government's program to develop a nuclear weapon to defeat, theoretically, Germany at first. Becomes the two weapons that are used to defeat Japan at the end of 1945, or middle of 1945. The first civilian energy reactors were developed in the 1950s, and there's an important distinction between the nuclear weapons that were developed in the 1940s and these civilian energy reactors. They both use uranium, although one of the bombs in the Manhattan Project did use plutonium. The splitting of the atom produces energy, and the reactors use nuclear power in that sense in the same way. But there's a fairly distinct firewall between a nuclear power reactor, a civilian power reactor, and a nuclear weapon. And the difference is, in order to produce uranium or plutonium that is weapons grade, that is explosive enough to cause a massive detonation, you would need to highly enrich the uranium. And this process was the critical technological development that the Manhattan Project produced in 1942 and 1943 in Oak Ridge, Tennessee. Civilian nuclear energy is typically, not always, but typically not with reprocessed uranium, which means it's not weapons grade. So it's not possible to build a nuclear weapon directly from civilian nuclear power. you could reprocess that uranium, but that's a different set of technological steps, and there's been a fairly distinct separation in the minds of most countries, not all of them, but most countries, that civilian nuclear energy is fairly distinct from the military uses of uranium and plutonium. So in the 1960s, you have the first commercial reactors that are selling energy go online, and they go online in the United States, France, and Russia primarily. The U.S. develops nuclear power plants throughout the 60s and the 70s. France is the country that really uses the majority of its energy grid comes from nuclear power. So France becomes the country that implements nuclear power the most. There have been three major problems with nuclear power in the last 30 or 40 years. The first one was on 3 Mile Island in New York, which was not quite a full meltdown of the nuclear power plant, but some radiation did leak. This did not cause a major health or environmental threat, but it did significantly undercut the domestic nuclear power movement in the United States. And there aren't any more nuclear power plants commissioned after 3 Mile Island. You do have some support for nuclear power after 3 Mile Island. In fact, the Washington governor of the early 1980s, Dixie Lee Ray, was a big advocate of nuclear power. But by and large, there's not as much support for nuclear power after 3 Mile Island. The two significant problems have been, in 1986, the Chernobyl meltdown, which was the full meltdown and explosion of a reactor where a whole set of safety features in the reactor didn't work. There was some operator error where the workers at the plant were supposed to take several safety steps they didn't take. The result was an explosion which caused some initial deaths and then a whole slew of radiation-related health problems. And the estimates on how big the problem has been in the last 20 years vary widely. The big study that was done a few years ago estimates potentially upwards of 1 million premature deaths based on the radiation from the meltdown. It's really hard to completely estimate all the impacts of Chernobyl. The last one is more recently the earthquake in Japan and the meltdown at the Fukushima reactor plant is causing environmental problems around the world and has more to do with problems in the ocean as well. So the environmental impacts of that particular situation are still largely unknown, although certainly not positive. So, a couple arguments for and against nuclear power. The first two arguments for nuclear power: it's considered clean energy, and I put clean in air quotes because certainly I'll talk about in the cons how nuclear power is not entirely clean, but nuclear power does not cause fossil fuel emissions. So nuclear power has been seen more recently as a potential alternative energy source that could reduce reliance on coal and oil and help to reduce global warming. It's also relatively reliable as a power source. Energy grids in a city could be powered by nuclear power, and there wouldn't be a whole lot of power going out in the power grid, at least if it works correctly. The cons of nuclear power are relatively straightforward. The first one is nuclear waste, that spent nuclear fuel is radioactive, very dangerous, has to be contained. It's extremely expensive to contain it, and it's basically functionally around forever because the half-life for uranium is about 10,000 years. And so there's the long-term storage options for spent nuclear fuel are not great. And that becomes a big detractor to the possible expansion of nuclear powers, what to do with nuclear waste, and then the health effects involving potential spills or accidents of that nuclear waste. And the other con would be the accidents, as I mentioned, the three of them in the problems on the left-hand side of the page, that the potential for a nuclear explosion creates all sorts of health and environmental effects. So, very brief explanation of two different forms of energy technology that you'll need to know. One is oil, the other is nuclear power.